just a bit around our presentation. Because of the restrictions that I'm under about talking the specifics of the project that I'm leading right now, we ask that if you have any questions related to anything that I might say or Alexander might say that are specific to that project, please hold on to those questions and we'll be able to answer them more fully in the non-recorded discussion afterwards. So I'm not meant to be talking about specifics during the recorded session. So just, yes, hold on to your questions and we'll get to them during the discussion period. Before we start our presentation, I wanted to briefly introduce first integrity and then the project that I'm leading that is partially what we'll be talking about today. For those of you who don't know integrity, we are currently getting ready to celebrate our 5th birthday on Friday. And we like to say that we were born in Syria. That's because our CEO, who is actually sitting over there, and our Director of Services, who is sitting over there, Anthony and Andrew, they met in Syria before the revolution. And drawn from discussions that they had subsequent to that meeting, integrity came into existence. And we've been providing a variety of consultancy services over the past 5 years, from research, monitoring and evaluation, client advisory services, across a range of geographies. We're headquartered here in London in Somerset House. We have regional offices in Beirut and Nairobi, and project office in Gaziantep, and a country office in South Sudan, as well as a range of and a wide network of consultants around the world that we can draw from, Alexander being one of them. Alexander is the Senior Security and Justice Advisor for the project that I'm leading and we'll be talking about somewhat today. It's, as Pilar has said, a multi-donor access to justice and security project that's being implemented by 2 partners in the opposition-held areas in northern Syria. And we're providing third-party monitoring services for that project. And much of what I will share with you today during the presentation is drawn from my experience over the last 10 months as team lead on that project. And I look forward to speaking with you more about that and answering your questions in the discussion period. So without further ado, we'll turn it over to Alexander, who will give us his perspectives and expertise questioning security and justice assistance in context of ongoing conflict.
Thank you, Kathryn. So this is a discussion, and what we are trying to do today is present a couple of questions and introduce a topic to which we don't have clear answers to. So we are very much looking forward to discussing them with you. The topic of today's presentation is security and justice assistance in active conflict. Can it be done, and perhaps even should it be done? By way of introduction, let me say a few words about the framework for these reflections, where we come from. What we use as a framework is basically the policy framework of security sector reform as stated by the OECD, by the United Nations, by the European Union. And the key concepts we will be referring to is a notion of security and justice that is people-centered, an approach that looks at the security and justice sector as a system, a reform agenda that pursues 2 core goals: to establish a security and justice sector that is, on the one hand, effective in its service delivery, and secondly, accountable about the services it delivers. In terms of process, a process that is locally driven and locally meaning a process that is not just government-led, but inclusive, including all stakeholders in the security and justice sector, and an approach that is contextual, that is not an approach that uses prefabricated tools and transfers those from one context to the next. Our approach is also one that brings practitioners' perspectives, and our perspective is very much one of security and justice practitioners. So while this conversation could be infused by debates, development debates around particularly engagements in conflict-related and fragile contexts, our perspective is very much a thematic security and justice perspective. Now, still by way of introduction, let me say that the record of security and justice assistance of SSR is rather patchy. If we look at security and justice programming today, what we see still is approaches that focus foremost on the needs of the service, on the needs of security and justice institutions, rather than taking the security and justice needs of people as their starting point. What we see very frequently still are stovepipe rather than systemic approaches. We see police programs, we see programs focusing on intelligence services, we see programs focusing on courts. What we rarely see is programs that adopt a systemic approach to security and justice. What we also see is, despite the rhetoric, we see most programs focusing on building the capacity of service delivery institutions rather than their accountability. What we also see is that the dimension of sustainability is far too little considered in security and justice programming, that we provide assistance without considering the elements that should and could ensure the sustainability of these programs. What we also see is that programs far too often continue to be externally driven rather than locally owned, that external political agendas drive the programming in security and justice rather than local priorities and political contexts. And what we continue to see is that programs, once they are being implemented, that they are government-led and do not involve broader constituencies and are not inclusive in considering the views and interests of broader stakeholders. And finally, what we continue to see is that the program approach taken to security and justice programs is not contextual, but uses templates that are transferred from one context to the next and are not contextualized or insufficiently contextualized in these specific contexts. Still by way of introduction, security and justice development is challenging in developed contexts. For instance, police development in developed countries continues to be an extremely challenging exercise. When we look at training programs in developed countries, the impact they have on behavior, on behavioral change on those being trained is often minimal. The record of security and justice programming, of security and justice assistance in development contexts is very, very patchy. And I understand that within that series you have had or will have discussions on the report by the Independent Commission on Aid Impact, or for Aid Impact, on its Security and Justice report, where we see that the impact of security and justice programming is very, very limited. If we say that the record is patchy in development contexts, in conflict, security and justice assistance is a high-risk enterprise. Why is that? Let me look at a few characteristics of conflict. General characteristics include a high degree of uncertainty in conflict environments. Very little is known about the situation. Not only is there little known, but the situation changes rapidly, and there is very little we can count on for certain.
I think our work in Syria probably best demonstrates this. So we have a sample of communities where this program is being implemented, where we're tracking at the time very high level social change, trying to link that back to program activities around police capacity, around communities' perception of the police and their behavior. And we go back to these communities on a quarterly basis. And for 3 quarters, there was one particular community who, it was like the eye of the storm in the middle of the conflict in Syria. You know, we'd have quotes from people saying, everything is normal here. There's no conflict, there's nothing going on. For three quarters, and we thought, wow, that particular community, you know, kids are playing at the playgrounds, you know, there are no barrel bombs. It's just this kind of island of security. So we submitted our last quarterly report, and within days, ISIS was pushing through and completely changed the dynamics of that community, completely changed our access to that community. And you know, you could sit there and report for several quarters that everything is going great, and then in an instant, it changes completely. And we see that time and again, and being able to program, being able to monitor that program when the dynamics shift, you know, hourly at times, is an extraordinary challenge to programs in these ongoing contexts or ongoing conflicts.
Another characteristic, a general characteristic of conflict that impacts on security and justice programming is what I call its messiness. The outcomes of the conflict and the developments the conflict takes are so unpredictable that it has a significant impact on security and justice programming. Finally, one more general characteristic I want to mention is the social complexity we encounter in conflicts. There are many actors with different values, different agendas, different objectives. There is very little or no common ground to build on, which makes programming in these contexts highly difficult.
And again, I think Syria is a very good example of this. I mean, my own career, I worked in Afghanistan, and I was thinking, my God, how complex the social life in Afghanistan, the political context, And then I went to work on and in Somalia, and I thought, oh my God, how complex this, this really eclipses what I saw in Afghanistan. And I'm having that same reaction in Syria, where if you try to do a conflict actors map of just one area in one governorate, you're going to have a massive plethora of armed actors, different court systems, and it's very difficult because their alliances shift rather rapidly and frequently. They wear different hats. Once they start a new campaign, they'll change their name, they'll change their branding. It's very difficult to keep track of who's who on the ground in the area where this program is being implemented.
What does this mean in terms of social institutions? What we encounter frequently is that institutions are either dysfunctional or have collapsed. State institutions usually collapse in these contexts. And whatever institutions exist or continue to operate, these institutions have porous boundaries. So individuals move in and out informally and can be encountered in different capacities. So individuals could have multiple functions at the same time because these institutions are so porous, have porous institutional boundaries. Processes and arrangements are very often informal. There are no formal processes for appointments, for dismissals, and processes are made, decisions are taken on an informal basis. Then what we usually encounter in these contexts is that these institutions have to confront legacies of abuse and face significant trust deficits.
I think, again,
Yeah.
Syria is a really good example of how this dynamic plays out. And it doesn't necessarily need to be something that is a negative. As I'm sure we're all aware, the security apparatus in Syria had a very bad reputation for abuses and under the regime. And in the opposition-held areas of Syria now, there's this new civilian police force that this program is supporting, trying to take hold and trying to combat that reputation of abuse. And what we have seen is this strong desire by these defected police officers, because this police force is made up largely by police officers who have defected from the regime. And there's a desire to offer something different. What we saw in some of the research that we've done under our monitoring has been this initiative that started with a revolution, a strong desire for something different. And the police are part of that. And they're really working to demonstrate to their communities that we're different. And part of this dynamic is because under the regime, police officers were never allowed to work in their community of origin. They were always sent somewhere else. And what we're seeing now, because of the conflict and because they've defected, they've gone back home. And now they're working in their communities. And it's actually helped establish this level of trust because they know who that police officer is. They might be related to that police officer. And it's gone a considerable way to address those trust deficits. And so this doesn't necessarily have to be a negative thing. There are ways that, at least what we've seen, there are ways that it can be addressed.
Okay. Now, if we look specifically at the security sector, what we see often is what I call a militarization of security, meaning that the military and armed groups take over all security functions and marginalize other actors such as the police in the security sector. And even going beyond that, we see a securitization of politics, not a politicization of security, but a securitization of politics, in that military and armed actors dominate the political agenda in these contexts. If we consider these characteristics of conflict contexts, what then are some of the risks of security and justice assistance in conflict? Here a few risks we have encountered in our work. First, capacities that are being built and provided through assistance in that area cannot be sustained because the systems to ensure sustainability are not in place or continue to be destroyed. A second risk, and I'll come back to that in a second, is that the capacities we build in an environment that is so dominated by uncertainty and fluidity dissipate in this context. So they cannot be sustainable. They dissipate in this context because of its fluidity.
And one of the examples that we saw, in some of the sample communities, the program had been suspended briefly several months ago. And in one of the communities, for several reasons, lack of institutional identity, lack of community support, some of the police officers did not remain with the police service. They also have concerns about livelihood. They have to provide for their families. And so they joined armed groups. They left the police force. So that capacity, that training that goes into supporting them dissipates throughout other groups. And it's definitely something that we have to take into consideration, particularly around issues with livelihoods. If you're providing a stipend, which is the primary source of income for police officers, there are risks involved in the cases where the program is suspended, that capacity is going to disappear simply because of the pressure on that person to be able to provide for himself and his family. So it's one of those considerations and risks to take into account when designing programs.
A third risk we encounter in security and justice assistance programming in conflict is that capacities that are provided are being abused. So, for instance, capacities that are being built up to conduct law enforcement activities are being used in combat situations. Capacities could also be redirected. Capacities provided to the police are taken from the police and are used by armed groups in conflict. Or even worse, institutions could be converted and officers could be rehatted. Security officers could be rehatted. So an institution that is built up as a police service turns into an armed group. A fourth area of risks in security and justice assistance in conflict is that capacities that are being built up cannot be used because the institution is restricted in its functions, in its mandate. It is not allowed to carry out the functions it is supposed to carry out with the capacities it has. I'll come back to that in a second. And the final risk I would like to point out is that the wrong capacities were built. We imagine building up the capacities of an institution, for instance, that in the future is supposed to become the police service of a post-conflict country, the situation develops differently, and this actor is pushed aside and other actors take on these functions. Or what we also might insufficiently consider is that fighters who have performed, who have been in combat throughout the conflict, return home, return with a high degree of legitimacy, have little to do, have sufficient training, and take on the functions that have been built up in the institutions that we're hoping would be conducting law enforcement or other functions.
Isn't that something that you've seen in your work in Libya?
Libya might be an example where this has happened in the recent past, where armed groups have taken on law enforcement powers and have not allowed the Ministry of Interior and the police to take on these functions after the conflict ended. Yeah. Did you want to add to this? No. So, just to visualize this phenomenon of dissipating capacities. Imagine a situation, a common approach. In development in security and justice assistance, we identify a need to build urgent capacity, for instance, for, I don't know, emergency response or VIP protection or election security. So what we do is we establish a program that would provide training and equipment to build up units that can perform these types of functions. What happens frequently in conflict and immediate post-conflict contexts is that we end up having a few trained officers in a few units with capacity who dissolve back into a dysfunctional and fluid context. And the effort that has gone into building up these capacities disappears in this fluid context. To visualize the phenomenon of restricted capacities, which is one we have also encountered in our work, is, say, for instance, we aim with our security and justice program to build up a police service. So we have an institution that is called police and whose capacity we aim to build up. But what we encounter very often, that this institution is not allowed to do what a police is usually mandated to do. So is not allowed to take on all law enforcement functions. Very often it is restricted to an area of non-contentious functions, and armed groups take on, or the military take over responsibility for the key law enforcement functions, such as crime prevention and crime detection. And whenever significant stakes are at play, the police is not allowed to do policing. It is restricted to a fairly uncontentious area, such as civil registry functions or similar types of non-contentious or emergency response or the like.
This dynamic we see all over the communities that we're looking at in Syria. And because the civilian police are not armed, they're not provided with arms or weapons through this program, they are the weakest security provider in the community. And depending on the context, individual context of the community, there could be one main armed actor that they then have to negotiate this operating space, or in what is reality for many of these civilian police units, particularly in large populated urban areas, there are a plethora of armed groups that are vying for that monopoly of violence, if you will. And what we see happening is the police are allowed to operate if they are doing those non-contentious security provisions, and sometimes not even security provisions. Sometimes it is documentation. Oh, I need my birth certificate or marriage certificate. And when it comes to actually arresting anyone or doing anything beyond apprehending a petty thief, the armed group will step in and make it impossible for them. For example, we've seen over and over, if the police goes in and arrests a member or a family member of an armed group, the armed group will come to the station and by force take that suspect back with them. So it completely cuts off any opportunity of the police to play any significant security provider role in their communities.
And even worse, what we have also seen is that the police is told or are tasked to perform functions that are non-police functions, such as morality police functions or other functions or emergency response functions. So they are asked to take on responsibilities that we would not want police services to take responsibility for. So, should we be doing security and justice assistance in conflict? Certainly, it is, as we have said, a high-risk undertaking. And certainly, traditional security and justice approaches are very often not applicable in these contexts. So when we are concerned that community policing programs have little impact in development contexts, we should not apply them to conflict contexts. Also, log frame approaches are of limited use in these contexts. If you use a log frame in such a context, you need to use too many assumptions. It is far too long-term in its perspectives and far too stiff in its approach. It is too stiff to operate in such a fluid context.
And I can speak to this, just being an M&E practitioner. You have to love a log frame, right? And you need to be able to set out from the beginning your objectives in a rational, logical way so you can agree with everyone what it is you're trying to achieve. But the way that we've adopted from the development program side of things, this very, as Alexander was saying, very rigid approach to planning these programs does not work and does not allow you to do the frequent revisiting and revising easily or quickly. It's a Herculean task that will crush the soul of most people. And it's extremely difficult. It's made me really reflect on what should we be doing? What can we be doing when we want to organize our approach and understand the program, design the program in a way that we can measure results? What should we be doing? And I think this is a really great question that I'd like to be able to explore a little bit further, hopefully in the discussion.
So there are certainly good reasons to stay away from security and justice assistance in conflict and to focus on political, military, and humanitarian assistance only. Are there reasons for doing security and justice assistance in conflict? I would argue there are some reasons for doing so. What we have observed is that armed actors, armed groups that provide comprehensive government services have a legitimacy surplus and have therefore a comparative advantage over armed groups that are not in a position to do so, and are therefore also in a comparative advantage because they are the ones who are ready, once the conflict ends, to provide government services after the conflict.
And this is one of the main challenges you have when you have groups like Jabhat al-Nusra or ISIS that come in and they make it their mission to be able to provide effective services across the board: governance, health, security, policing, and to be able to provide this counter narrative to that when much of what we see from programming is not as effective is extremely difficult.
So, what would be then the goals of providing security and justice assistance in conflict? I would identify two goals. The one would be it should support the overall political and military strategy in the conflict. And secondly, it should, while it cannot build state institutions, it should prepare for post-conflict state building. So the risks of engagement and of non-engagement need to be very carefully assessed. More concretely then, what would be some of the elements of what I would call a conflict-sensitive security and justice approach? First, it would have to be a type of programming that is based on continuous assessments and reassessments and be able to constantly adapt to a changing and fluid environment.
Yes, and this is something that we're constantly doing in both the program that we're monitoring and our own monitoring approach, because things can change in an instant. For example, last October, in one of the governorates in which we were getting ready to start our first round of monitoring, 2 days before the monitoring was supposed to start, Jabhat al-Nusra came in and took over a large portion of that particular governorate. And we had to completely adjust our approach. So that's just on the monitoring side. Imagine if you're trying to implement this huge program across, several governorates in multiple communities, and being able to flexibly reflect on what is the context, how is this affecting our original work plan, our original log frame, and how is that going to impact what our outputs and our outcomes were meant to be. And going back to the point that I made previously, doing that within the current constraints of what are traditionally development approaches to program design and management, it's not flexible enough. It doesn't really lend itself to that continual reassessment and adjustment.
Secondly, a conflict-sensitive approach to security and justice assistance should set very modest and short-term goals, again, to ensure that the program can be adjusted to the fluid and changing environment. And thirdly, the program should not focus on ideal futures, but should start with the existing realities. A term I quite like is the term best fit approaches that the World Development Report of 2011 uses, which emphasizes that best solutions might not always be the most fitting for such contexts, but we need to be able to use second best solutions in such complex contexts. Secondly, this means adopting approaches that are flexible and that are local and are built upwards, that the program starts with community realities and is adapted to the realities of different communities within the same context. It also means that we should latch on to constants, as I would say, and this means in conflicts often anchoring the program with armed groups. By doing so, the focus needs to be on empowering these armed groups to doing security and justice a little better, and therefore providing a compelling counter-narrative to actors with more radical approaches. Did you want to add?
No.
No. Good. So, concretely, what could this mean? How could we assist armed groups to do, for instance, policing a little better? We could encourage and help armed groups to separate military from policing functions and encourage them to establish policing unit within their armed groups. We could help armed groups to make these policing units identifiable as police and provide them with uniforms, provide them with badges and identification numbers and cards. We could also help these groups to strengthen their institutional culture and identity so that police functions become so that police officers identify with their institutions and become proud being part of these institutions. We might also think creatively of tasks and responsibility that are particularly relevant in these contexts, such as emergency response functions, and attach policing to these emergency and response functions.
And this is something that's happening kind of on its own, organically in Syria. There's a civil defense that has volunteers throughout the same areas in which the security program is being implemented. And in many of the communities, going back to the idea of non-contentious police services, the police are actually on their own going to work with the civil defense to help clear rubble, help rescue people after bombings, helping them cordon off the area. So this is something that is happening of its own volition that could be supported and made more formal than just random ad hoc where the need arises within the communities. It's an area that there is space for them to support.
References for such a conflict-sensitive approach to security and justice assistance we could think of would be, for instance, international humanitarian law rather than international human rights law as a starting point, in particular Common Article 3 for non-international conflicts. It might also be useful to think of gendarmerie-type policing, of policing that has its origins in the military and has evolved out of the military, and regimes that are used for gendarmeries might be useful starting points for developing policing functions of armed groups and similar. Another reference point we thought of were detention regimes used by military or even by UN peacekeepers in early post-conflict environments in which the police has not yet been established or has not yet been deployed. These might be starting points to think of a conflict-sensitive approach to security and justice assistance. If we look at how could we help armed groups to do justice a little bit better, we suggest make a far greater effort at understanding the existing systems and identify the least bad approaches in providing security and justice, and work with those doing doing justice a little better.
I think in the context of Syria and perhaps Libya, although I know less about justice in Libya, what this would mean for me is to have experts who understand Sharia law. Because right now, in much of opposition Syria, that is the court system. Whether it's linked to a extremist Islamic group, armed group, or whether it's just a civilian court or replaced the civilian court system. It's either the Unified Arabic Code or Sharia law of some form. And I don't think that we do enough to really understand the nuances of the different applications and interpretations of Sharia law. So having experts that can really dig into that and be able to make recommendations and identify the least bad. I think there's a lot of resistance when you use the term Sharia, that immediately we don't want to engage. But the reality is, if you want to engage in justice in this particular context, you're going to have to do that through a Sharia court system, or a court that espouses some form of Sharia law. So really understanding what that means in practice and not being afraid of that word, I think, is the first step in engaging in justice in this context.
Other approaches used in post-conflict and more developmental contexts, such as mobile courts, might be a useful approach, that are not tied to buildings and institutions, but that can be adapted flexibly to a fluid conflict environment. And finally, one additional approach we have seen that might contribute to overcoming the situation of uncertainty and fluidity in these contexts and helping to do justice a little bit better would be to start with a codification from bottom up of the procedures that are being used in the existing court structures in such fluid environments.
Yeah, I think that's something that came up in our last quarter, was that when you ask people what the court system is doing, or what customs they're using, we know what the customs are, but they're not written down anywhere that we know of. So being able to first try to understand the decisions that are being handed down by the judges in individual courts, as well as trying to collate all of those customs, whether it's alternative disputes or just that particular community's custom on arbitration or conflict management. Being able to have that written down is another good step in working towards being able to engage with justice in conflict.
Good. So these are a few initial thoughts we had on what it might mean to do security and justice assistance in conflict situations. Obviously, the risks of doing so are very high, and there might be very good reasons of not engaging. But if you engage, these might be some starting points of how you could do so. And we're looking forward to hearing your suggestions and views on these topics. Thank you.